Hey everyone, Mr. Kimson here, and today we're looking at this idea of displaying data. There's a lot of information in the world. How do we kind of process it? How do we represent it? That's what we're looking at in this lesson. Now, sorry, it's just a little bit bright in here. Do you mind if I put my sunnies on? Just give me a second. Alright, that's better. Okay, cool. Now who's just working from home? Quite have a good view, hey? Alright, so we're looking at displaying data, and before we kind of start, there's a few considerations we need to make. First of all, like what kind of information do we actually have here, and what do you actually want to do with it? That's really important when we think about displaying the data that we have. Now for categorical data, so that's stuff that we generally use words to represent, we have a few options. We like to use bar charts, we like to use pie charts, and there's a new one that we're going to look at in this topic. It's called Pareto charts, right? Let's talk about pie charts for a second. There's an awesome scene from How I Met Your Mother, which looks at Marshall, and he's comparing these pie charts and bar charts. It's a good one.
This is a pie chart describing my favorite bars. And this is a bar graph describing my favorite pies.
Yeah, cracks me up every time. A little bit nerdy, but you gotta own it, right? Now, let's look at a few examples of these. So here's a pie chart. If you're anything like me, you spend a lot of time not actually watching Netflix, but just looking for something to watch on Netflix. So that's me whenever I watch something on there. Here's a cool graph about graphs, or graph about graphs, depending on how you want to say it. Pie charts made of pie are definitely very cool. So that one gets my vote. Cool. That's the different type of categorical representation. I want to talk about Pareto charts at the end because that's a little bit different. Numerical data. Now, we have a few different things that you've learned over the past few years. Histograms, you might remember, frequency polygons, stem and leaf plots, and line graphs. That's reserved for continuous data, okay? So that's stuff that there's no gaps between the different values, right? So for example, time is a good example of continuous data because you can always measure every instance of time, whereas time goes there. Whereas something which would be discrete data is like the number of people in a room, right? You can have one or two people or three people, but you can't really have 1.5 kind of people, right? Let's talk about histograms, because histograms are very similar to bar charts and they often get confused, right? With the histogram, you notice that first of all, there's a few things. There's no gaps between them. That's something that's mandatory, okay, that has to happen. And also you'll notice very subtly, there's a half width gap at the beginning. These are mandatory, right? Because what actually happens is what we need is on top of the curve, we can overlay something called a frequency polygon. Now, the way you construct a frequency polygon is that you take the midpoints, this is for the polygon now, you take the midpoints of the columns and you connect them up in a particular way, right? So if I take the midpoints of all these columns here, so I just put a little dot in between all of these, and I get my ruler, and I start ruling out these lines here. I start from the corner over here, and then I start joining these all up. Yeah, I obviously didn't use a ruler there. Let's go back. That's what happens when you try to go freehand. Don't use freehand, kids, use a ruler. And then at this point, this is why they sometimes use a half-width gap at the end as well, just to make it easy. You just join these up. Okay, so if you're kind of thinking, hey, why do we need this no gap thing? Why do we need this half width gap thing? Well, the whole intention is that the area under this frequency polygon, because what's a polygon? A polygon is just like a shape, right? The area underneath this frequency polygon is meant to be the same as the area between underneath the columns as well. So if you kind of looked at these areas, you can see that even though at some sections it seems to capture things which actually aren't underneath, that's kind of made up by the fact that it undercuts things. So example up here, right? That's kind of matched up with this area over here. So that's the idea. That's why we leave the half width gap at the beginning, and then there's no gaps in between columns, so we can create this frequency polygon. Yeah. So that's the first two there. Just a note about column graphs, right? Column graphs, you'll notice they tend to have gaps. They tend to have gaps is the emphasis. So there's no real requirement that I'm aware of. Depends which message you ask, right? because they love arguing about stuff like this. But there's no strict requirement that bar charts or column graphs have to have gaps. So that's just something to be aware of. Yeah, but they tend to draw them with gaps. The other thing that's different is that histograms are for numerical data, right? So we're looking at numbers over here. Yeah, so whereas bar charts and column graphs are usually used for categorical, so words. All right, here's a line graph. So obviously with a line graph, they use a continuous line. It has to be used with continuous data as well, though. But this is not continuous data, so this is actually a bad line graph. It's still a funny one nonetheless. So we are looking at global temperature versus number of pirates, and it seems like there's a relationship between them. But that's another topic called correlation, and we'll look at that in future topics. But it's just an interesting relationship between them. Obviously, the number of pirates and global temperature levels aren't related. Well, I mean, I hope not. At least that would be a very strange relationship. But yeah, so just as a note, this is actually probably a bad example because the number of pirates, like that should be a whole number thing. We shouldn't use a line graph for that. So that's a bad example of that. Yeah, cool. Stem and leaf plot, you've seen those before. The idea with the stem and leaf plot is that like this is your stem, kind of like the stem of a tree or a plant or something, and then these coming out here are your leaves, I suppose, if you want to visualize it like that. Some important things to note, again, we tend to use this for discrete data, and also what do these stem and leaves represent? Well, the leaf is the last digit of your number, and then the stem would be your first digit in this case, or sometimes you can see we've got the first two digits here as well, so the first digits. And so for example, here's a number, that would be 44, right? This one would be 46. So all of these here, they are different. Oh, there was a bit of lag there. They represent different numbers, right? So that's the idea behind this. Obviously, there's no 50 in this case, otherwise there would be a 50. So they obviously didn't have that there. And so all of these individual parts of the leaf represent the different numbers. Okay, cool. Here's a better line graph because selling price, right, dollars, they can generally be continuous, although again that's another thing up for debate. I won't get too into detail about that, but we can have like decimal values as an example, right? But this one looks slightly different, right, because if you look at it, there's another section over here and it's called percent. Okay, and the percentage, if I see that on the right hand side of my axis, I'm thinking, well, that's a bit different. Frequency, yeah, that's all well and good. But for percentage, what's going on here? This is what we call a cumulative frequency polygon. Okay, it's got a funny little name, an ogive or ogive or ogive, depending on how you want to pronounce it. Ogivy, I don't know. So what's going on here? Well, the idea is that it's the cumulative frequency polygon. So cumulative means like a running total. So basically, instead of each of these dots representing like that individual point, it's actually a running total leading up to that. So you can see this is why it goes up to 100%, right? Because at the end, you're meant to get to 100% of your data. The idea with having a percentage axis. Well, the idea is that we look at this and I can say easily how many fell under a certain price, right? What percentage? For example, here I can tell you that 100% were less than 100,000, right? If we're looking at the prices of houses being sold. If I wanted to look at 50%, I'd look over here and I'd see that, okay, 50%, less than 50% were sold at 200,000. And that's just like a different way of looking at things. Yeah. This is something new. It's called a Pareto chart. And you can see it looks different because, well, it looks like there's kind of two things going on here, right? We actually have a column graph and we have kind of a line graph as well, right? You can see there's these values coming along here. So there's the two things there, column graph and a line graph. What are we kind of doing with that? Well, the idea with those is that I'm thinking, all right, I want to see what are the most kind of important factors in a situation. So let's look at user complaints, right? If people are complaining about things, I want to target the things that people are complaining about the most. And so you can see over here, the user complaints for maybe like a product or something, or a company is that maybe the product doesn't work, there's poor tech support, there's low quality. But then afterwards, all of these little guys, they're not contributing to too much. Like, yeah, the bugs in the program, or the unresponsiveness, they are factors that people care about, but not many people care about those. So if you think about addressing your efforts into addressing some of these and fixing some of these, you're probably going to want to focus on these guys over here, right? There's another thing that's associated with this called the 80-20 rule. I'll talk about that in the Pareto chart lesson. Same thing over here though. Reasons for arriving late. If you've arrived late to school, you might have come up with some of these. Well, you probably don't want to tell them that you just slept in. So the next one after that, that you'll probably tell them is like transport. But yeah, so reasons for arriving late. Slept in was the biggest one by far, and then they've got family, and then they've got appointments. But again, just reading this graph, right, and you have to be careful when you're reading this, because we know that there's a percentage over here, but it's a cumulative percentage. So remember, what does that mean again? It's a running total. Yeah. So I know that 100% of them considered all of these, right? What percentage considered sleeping in, for example? Well, if you look at this dot over here, and you try and align it to the right side, well, it looks like it's roughly, a bit tricky to see, maybe 30-something%, right, or close to 40. But here's where you have to be careful. Because this is a running total, right, you can't use this column graph over here. Yeah, and I'll talk a bit about more why in the next couple of lessons. But if you look at it, right, if you just took this column graph and you see, okay, yeah, it's about 190 people said this. If you take this column graph and you try and use it on the right axis over here, you'll notice it doesn't really make sense, because it seems to be saying that like 90-something% using the reason slept in, but then it seems like this here is about 70-something%, which would be more than 100%. So the important thing to remember is that the left side here, this is for the column graph. So this left axis is for the column graph, and this right axis, that's for the line graph, okay? So as you're doing these questions, just remember that the left side of the Pareto chart is for the column graph, and the right side is for the line graph. They can't be used interchangeably, because then you run into problems like that, okay? That's just a brief introduction into these different representations of graphs. We'll get into detail some of the questions you can look at.